Hi, I'm Matt Dietrich, editor of Reboot, Illinois, and this is another edition of Only in Illinois, your Reboot, Illinois weekly video recap. Last weekend, Senate President John Cullerton made a couple of statements in an interview on WGN radio that caused quite a stir throughout the week. President Cullerton stated essentially two things. Number one, that the state's pension crisis doesn't really rise to the level of crisis and shouldn't be termed a crisis. And number two, he said that the effort to enact pension reform is based mostly on the desire to see the Illinois temporary income tax increase of 2011 drop partially in 2015 as scheduled. I disagree with both of those statements, and I'm going to explain why. Let's take them one at a time. First, on the issue of whether this is a crisis. I think this rises to the level of crisis in two different ways. One, for the sake of the state budget and Illinois taxpayers. In the current fiscal year, more than 24% of state-generated revenue is going directly into the pension systems. If you go back to 1996, that percentage was 3.6% of state revenues that went into pension funds. In 2002, it went up to 6.6%, and it's been rising ever since. Under the current system, 5 years from now, in fiscal year 2019, we'll be spending more than 30% of all state-generated revenue on our pension system, and it continues to rise after that. When you're spending 30% of your state revenue on a pension system, and you're cutting into the amount that you can spend on education, on public safety, and on social services, that represents some seriously misplaced priorities. Number two, it's a crisis because the current pension system threatens the well-being of the pension funds that current public employees and retirees are relying on for secure retirements. That's because right now we have more money going out of those systems being paid out than we have coming in. And one of the biggest drivers of that problem is the fact that if you're a retiree, a public employee retiree in the state of Illinois right now, you receive a 3% raise every year for the rest of your life, compounded annually. The rate of inflation right now is about 1.5%. The 3% cost of living adjustment is one of the biggest drivers of increasing pension costs. It went into effect in 1989, and it's something that needs to be dealt with in pension reform. Now, on the issue of pension reform being driven solely by those who want to see their income taxes go down, I disagree as well. Let me explain. In 2011, the Illinois General Assembly voted to raise the Illinois income tax from 3% to the current 5% on individuals. The income tax increase is scheduled to sunset partially in 2015. So your individual tax rate will go down to 3.75%. President Cullerton in the radio interview acknowledged that that means that the state's going to lose what he estimates at $5.4 billion. That is a 15% chunk out of a general revenue fund that is roughly $35 billion. Right now, the state of Illinois, as of today, has about $5.3 billion in back bills that it needs to pay. By the end of the fiscal year, on June 30th, 2013, it's estimated that we'll have about $5.8 billion in unpaid back bills. If the state loses $5.4 billion in sometime during fiscal year 2015, there is no way right now that the state's prepared to weather that kind of revenue loss. Right now, 3 of the 4 Republican candidates for governor say they want to see that happen. Governor Quinn has not said what he wants to see happen in January 1st, 2015. So right now there's really no plan for how the state would deal with sudden revenue loss at a time when it's still going to have a massive stack of unpaid bills. Consider this too, as President Cullerton pointed out in his radio interview. Even the most optimistic projections for a pension reform bill, if it passes and if it's upheld by the courts, says that Illinois would save about $1.5 billion immediately in the year that it's enacted. So if we lose $5.4 billion in revenue and we save $1.5 billion, that's a pretty massive chunk that no one right now is talking about how we would make up for. Now, I've heard a lot of talk about cuts. We've heard this before, but I don't think anyone in Illinois should vote for someone until they know specifically where those cuts are going to come from. So I don't think that pension reform is being pushed solely because we want to see our taxes go down from 5% to 3.75%. I think these are two different issues that need to be considered one at a time. Pension reform needs to come first. We can deal with the tax question later. But for right now, to say that the people who are pushing pension reform are doing so only because they want to see the scheduled tax sunset happen, I think is misleading, and I think it's a distraction from the very, very tough decision at hand in pension reform. As I sit here today, the General Assembly adjourned in its first week of veto session, having done nothing on pensions. They'll come back in a couple weeks. They may address it then. Let's not talk about the tax situation right now until we get pensions solved. That's another edition of Only in Illinois. Please go to rebootillinois.com. I wrote quite a bit about this week. We've got an infographic that shows the expanding percentage of Illinois revenue that's been consumed by pension payments over the years. And we've got a lot of other good articles that explain the situation in depth.